after World War I, there were many things left over, but the two most notable things that were left over were pilots and surplus aircraft. And they were in France, as well as in the United States, as well as in Great Britain. France had more than one left over, planes and pilots. The United States was second in line with planes and pilots left over. So, as a result, things began to develop in both shipping as well as aircraft aviation. Other things were being developed at the same time. For example, rifles. I guess that the Springfield rifle was probably not going to be used much longer after World War I because it was kind of clunky and not very effective. But the M1 was the weapon of choice for World War II. I happen to have one of those at home, and if I'll bring it to you. And several converting large warships into aircraft carriers. They could do that because the speed at which airplanes landed was pretty slow. In addition, when a ship turned into the wind, the combination of the wind and the speed of the ship often matched the slow speed of the airplane coming in. And there are videos of biplanes landing on what looked like a carrier, it was a converted ship, and men running out to hang on to the handles at the rear of the wings and just bringing it back down on the surface. So that's how slow the aircraft was flying. That's how fast the wind and the ship were. The airplane. Moth is a really nice airplane, and the reason and I could see why, as they came off the production line, that it was a very popular airplane. It was cheap, again, because we talked about it yesterday. It was cheap because most countries were almost giving away their aircraft. They didn't know what to do with them. And I mentioned yesterday that we have an entire desert down in Tucson, Arizona, filled with airplanes from World War II and from the Korean War and from the Vietnam War that have been used in the thousands that are just sitting there. I think some of them are for sale. Most are not. The engines from some of the B-2s and B-47s are for sale. Anyway, the Moth was a British-built ship, and it was all over the world. In addition, retractable carriage came into play because it got rid of the drag that was associated with one of the approaches that were being taken by surplus planes was to enter air races or to better chance long-distance record with the amount of fuel it could carry on board. We also took a look at a gyroplane, which was the father of a helicopter. And the gyroplane looks kind of awkward. It flew, and this morning, sometime before the end of the class, I will show a short video of the gyroplane taking off and then coming down, landing without the front engine. You remember that the way the front engine was working was it was pulling the airplane up in the air, but as it started down the runway, the air flow itself was beginning to turn the blades. So as the blades turned because of the forward speed of the airplane, the blades themselves generated lift. There were no wings on a gyroplane. There might have been wings on the first one, but the subsequent ones, they discovered that the turning blades of the gyroplane were enough to provide the lift that would ordinarily have been provided. So if you think about it, yes. Well, one was built and one was tested, and that's about it. I don't recall anyone ever putting that into long-range production. But if you think about it, the wing area, you would compare the wing area with the diameter of the blades themselves. For example, in an aircraft today, like that 172 out here, if I stall that aircraft and I pitch the nose down, it won't pick up speed. The reason it is because the prop is still windmilling. If I turn off the engine, the prop will still be windmilling because of the forward speed. But that windmilling process is like putting a piece of plank out in front of the airplane. It amounts of drag. So the same is true. Define that of that circle. And that's why those thin blades can hold that aircraft aloft even though the area of the blade itself is small. The fact that it's spinning creates a virtual you may recall one of the problems they had was the fact that the blades themselves up and down as it went around, depending on which way the aircraft was being turned. And that was a big problem. We talked about a man by the name of Sierva. Sierva was the first one to design and develop a gyroplane. But he realized that there was a problem with the fact that as the blades went around, that they were actually going up and down relative to the gyroplane itself. And that caused some difficulty because as they went up and down, they changed the amount of lift. And many of the early attempts at gyroplaning, they would take off and they would just roll over and crash. And the reason for that is that because as the blades went around, they would create more lift on one side than on the other side, and it would just flip the gyroplane upside down. One of the things that I didn't realize is Orville Wright patented the wing flap. That was an interesting addition. I would have thought for sure after Glenn Curtiss had determined that ailerons were important, that he would have gone one more step and come up with wing flaps. But in fact, the history book tells me that Orville Wright patented the wing flap. Rotation. We talked about that yesterday, and hopefully I'll have a chance to show you a small video of that gyroplane in action and doing an auto rotation. Helicopter student pilot, you have to demonstrate your ability to have that helicopter lose power and land safely completely through auto rotation, which means that you have to be, I don't know what the minimum altitude is, probably 1,000 feet above the ground, when the instructor will then throttle the engine back to the point where it's not producing any engine lift. And so the only way for you to handle that helicopter is now to look straight down and know that you're going to come straight down towards the runway, and at the last minute you have just enough energy in those blades to be able to pull back slightly and land fairly softly. Trouble is that students don't always do it the right way, and a number of helicopters, many helicopters, have been destroyed as a result of students attempting auto rotations. This is the section of importance, airline and airmail. That was happening in the United States in particular. It was happening around the world, but I think the United States was really in a situation where, by the size of our country compared to countries like Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, our country is huge. Salespeople that come into this country, even today, expect that they're going to sell anything they want to all over the United States. A person come in and tell me, well, we're going to sell these things, and then next day we're going to sell in Chicago. Next day in the morning we're going to sell in Los Angeles. You could put Italy, Switzerland, England, and one other country, maybe Portugal. You could put those all inside California. Not even talking about how you can fit those inside the United States. Countries could fit neatly inside of California. There were airmail services all over the globe. we are in particular interested in the airmail service in the United States. So I wouldn't put a lot of emphasis in your notes on the Italy and France and Russia and Germany. Yes, they're important, and they're important for the history of aviation, but I would have you much more remember what was going on in the United States in terms of email and airmail, airmail, than anywhere else in the world. Very early on, right after the war, one of the things that the federal we should consider having the post office transmit these letters by aircraft, because they can say from Philadelphia to Washington in half the time, or Philadelphia to New York in half the time that it would take a train. And so the development of some phase of airmail, it got to the point, though, that the post office was not in a position to be in the aviation business. And so the federal government came up with the Airmail Act of 1925 and said the post office is not going to be in the business of carrying postal products in the air. We're going to turn that over to private carriers, and that has been the case ever since. The post office is not allowed, by the Act of 1925, not allowed to carry mail by aircraft. But they can put them on trains, they can put them on trucks, but the post office can only use vehicles to deliver mail and transport them by, and actually they have to contract trucking companies to transport the mail between cities. So they are allowed to use their vehicles to deliver to the postal boxes, home mailbox, but not anything else. Just briefly, moments ago, and that is that France, huge number of airplanes and planes that were surplus after the war. France decided that since they believed themselves to be the seatbed of aviation worldwide, they were going to continue to expand their operations by subsidizing not only companies but also individuals. And I can tell you from firsthand that's the case. A couple of years ago, when I was the president of our local glider club, I went over to France to visit the glider operations, and discovered that all the fields were given to the local organizations by the French government. The French government built motels on the fields themselves so that pilots could stay overnight and fly the next day. And so much of glider operations in France are subsidized by the government. That goes right along with what the government of France was doing at the end of World War I. Now, at this particular point, you can say that, as far as your notes are concerned, I would suggest that you simply indicate that France was in the forefront of providing money to private and public organizations to subsidize delivering the mail and to furthering aviation. I'm not going to ask you how many pilots they had. I'm not going to ask you how many airplanes they had. Those are not important. The only thing important about this particular slide is the fact that the French government continued to supply money to people to buy and fly airplanes. That's all you have to put down. This gentleman, his name is Latacroix in French. Latacroix. To remember his name, because I'm not going to ask it on a quiz. But he was one of the first people that went around the world and established airmail routes globally. And of course he had 14 airplanes that, as he pointed out, they were easy to work on and repair. But you might just remember his name, put it down, and indicate that he was the first one to establish global aviation rights over the airspace of countries around the globe. So he was the forerunner of global airmail. He had a lot of problems, as early anybody has problems. Early inventors, early aviators, early aircraft designers, early engine designers, early any designers, early email designers, early web designers, anybody. People have trouble because they can't anticipate all the myriad of things that are going to come up with people using their inventions. In Spain alone, he was having all kinds of shot down. There's Mr. Latécois. It's a pretty good quote as far as I'm concerned. It turns out that it's mostly true. Now, what happens is, all of a sudden, with all of these airplanes and all these people trying to do things all over the world, the nations of the world finally say, hey, wait a minute. If we let this thing go on, it's going to be chaotic. So we've got to do something about it. Somebody has to do something about it. So we have to have an organization that was the early forerunner of what other organization that you guys were already exposed to. Another organization today that is as a direct result of this early organization back in the early 1920s. What does it say aloud? You remember ICAO? International Civil Aviation Organization. ICAO. Okay, so the ICAO is essentially keeping track of all of the agreements that were made around the world as far as airspace and air routes are concerned. And again, Germany got involved in all this, and in fact, they were not supposed to be doing anything in aviation, but they wound up making treaties with other countries on their own. And as a result, they began to get more aircraft and more routes. So they kind of snubbed their nose at the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I. So look at this one. I'm sorry. Okay. So, in 1920 alone, 50 German companies applied. Does this name sound familiar? The Luft means air, and the Hansa means an organization or an association of merchants that banded together to get things accomplished. That would be like something like our unions, trade organization. Air, A-I-R, the German word. Now, of course, Lufthansa Airways began to the point where it became British Airways. British Airways is a huge airline. It's the flag carrier of Britain, much like Pan American Airways used to be the flag carrier of the United States. We call it the U.S. was Pan American. The legacy airline of Great Britain was British Airways. And it developed as a result of all of the surplus airplanes and all the very smart people who wanted to use those surplus airplanes to get things accomplished and make money. So just remember, British Airways was one of the ones, it's a very big airline today. You remember the record that we looked at were being flown. So that airline has been around a long time after having merged a number of smaller airlines that were started up right after World War I. And it talks about South America, and it talks about South Pacific. All that's interesting. It's not really crucial of the history of aviation the way I want you to understand it. Remember I told you before, because of the information you gave me the other day, I've taken a slightly different approach to this course. I'm going to make it a little bit more understanding for you and a little bit easier for you to remember some of the details, because some more obscure details that I might have used in the past on something I'm not going to be using any longer. Okay, so the United States, here's information about the United States. The Post Office airmail service. However, it got to the point where the government decided that the post office should be delivering mail to consumers and businesses and not in the aviation business. But you can see between 1918 and 1990, there were 7,700 flights that jumped to 1,600, and there were 80,000 miles covered that jumped to 400,000 miles. Yeah, there were 180 forced landings, but that was the nature of aviation back then. So 1918 was right at the end of World War I, and within 1 year after the end of World War I, they were flying 1,600 flights and 400,000 miles. Yes, we had some coast-to-coast mail, transcontinental mail coverage. I think the important thing to note here is that how rapidly airmail increased in the United States immediately after World War I. You don't have to remember 1,600 flights or 400 miles. I'm not interested in that. I am interested in the knowledge that you understand that in the era immediately following World War I, the United States Postal Service expanded airmail tremendously. And of course, it points out the first coast-to-coast airmail service was 83 hours long. Who's going to stand for that? I mean, maybe a lot of people, because if you put them in a truck or in a train, it's going to take longer than that, isn't it? Of course, 83 hours is what, 3.5 days? I would think a train ought to be able to make it to the West Coast in 3.5 days. Maybe not, though. No, that's right. Even from today, in a streamliner from Chicago to San Francisco takes 2.5 days. Okay, so number 3, 2 acts of Congress. The Airmail Act of 25 and the Air Commerce Act of 26 took the post office out of airmail. And believe me, they were certainly right to do that, because innovation in the aviation industry, just to haul airmail alone, increased rapidly. That was one of the best moves that Congress ever made, and I'm not sure they realized how well they did. If it had been left in the hands of the post office, we might still be flying Jennies and doing horse carts. So here we are in 1926, right immediately after the Airmail Act and the Air Commerce Act. In 1926, 11 companies got together and decided they wanted to send airmail. Okay, so that brings us to the close here. I want to show you. You want to go back? Okay. I want to show you a couple of clips that are interesting, in that I talked to you yesterday about how rapidly aviation improved in airspeed. Remember, it went from 126 miles an hour to 297 miles an hour over a period of about 5 years. And one of the areas that got the most attention were amphibian aircraft. Surprisingly, that fast with a big, huge airplane. You ready? You're not?